Hello everyone, welcome to From the Star Wars Library, where Star Wars is in print, the Force is with the readers, and this time we go to the newspaper strips to uncover an essential part of the Star Wars saga. No, I'm not kidding, there's actually an essential story being told in the pages of those newspaper strips this time around. I'm your host, Nathan P. Butler. The story we're looking at this time is entitled Iceworld, and ran from October 4th through November 14th of 1982. These days you can find it in a few places. You can find it in Volume number 2 of that Russ Cochran set of the newspaper strips, unedited, unrefined, uncolored here. These run from page 291 to about page 308 in this particular volume here. You will also find this in the pages of Classic Star Wars from Dark Horse Comics, number 12. Now this is picking up in number 12, for what it's worth, right here at this section. The Millennium Falcon launches off from dealing with Raskar in the Power Gym, and we pick up there with it landed on Yavin 4. That is where Iceworld picks up in this issue. We then move on into the next issue, which is issue number 13. And issue 13, again, kind of stops midway with this particular story, where you basically get to this point. And at this point, that's when the story kind of skips ahead and moves on into the next of the many and varied tales that we get from the pages of Classic Star Wars, from the newspaper strips. You can find both of those issues as part of the issues covered in Classic Star Wars Volume 2, The Rebel Storm. There's been a recent release here within the feed. For those of you who are curious about, what's the deal with this Classic Star Wars stuff? Where is it available? What did they reprint? Where did they use that name? When did they use the name and yet not stick with it, for instance? All that kind of stuff covered in a recent supplemental episode here of From the Star Wars Library. It is supplement number 2, if you're looking for it, entitled, What is Classic Star Wars? With the quotes around it if you are doing a search for it within the description or looking for the title of the actual episode. So, in the pages of Classic Star Wars, we now have an essential story. It's kind of surprising that we have an essential story because it does not happen very often. The basic gist of this story is that Luke has escaped from Eridus. That's the last time we saw him in a mission. That was a couple of storylines ago, the return of Ben Kenobi. Since then, he's been on his way back to Yavin 4, but he has been harassed repeatedly by Imperial TIE fighters and such. So, he's wound up having to, him and the droids here, he's wound up having to basically get right along with a comet and kind of follow in its trail to try to use its pull to get away from the Imperials. The problem is that in doing so, he manages to damage the ship and come crashing down on what was, to him at the time, a relatively unknown ice world. And he winds up searching around. He is pretty much freezing. Question of whether or not he's going to be able to survive. Obviously, C-3PO could, but he'd run out of power eventually. But he's somewhat saved here, as I lose my grip, by someone on a mysterious animal. Of course, this is 1982, 2 years after The Empire Strikes Back. We know it's a Tauntaun, which screams to us this is probably Hoth. As such, we get the brief kind of obligatory encounter between him and his rescuer. The rescuer turns out to be a woman named Freya, or Frija, F-R-I-J-A. I always used to pronounce it Freya. I don't know if you're supposed to pronounce it Freya or Frija. So I say Freya. We later learn in the EU she is Freya or Frija Torlock. She's there with her father, an Imperial governor, who doesn't get named in this story, but is later named Governor Torlock. So the conflict here comes down to, are they going to leave the planet? Because Luke is there and kind of is offering Freya a way to get off the planet, assuming that she wants to, and assuming that she can help him to stay alive long enough for maybe the rebels to be able to save them. They actually go and try to scavenge some parts so that they can get a working communicator going, so that with that communicator he might be able to reach out to the Rebel Alliance. Torlock, the governor, doesn't want her to go, doesn't want them to go, because according to him, they have fled from the Empire, but they also have no love, apparently, for the Rebellion, so he wants to keep her there, keep her safe. Just the two of them, but she's growing tired of that and frustrated by all of that. By the time we get to the end of the story, it is revealed that this bickering father and daughter, they're not even human. They're essentially human replica droids of Freya and her father. They were created so that they themselves could cover for and double for the real governor and his daughter when they escaped from the Empire to supposedly defect to the Rebel Alliance. So what we got here is people acting human who aren't human, kind of playing up that sci-fi trope of sort of human-like androids and such. But they're able throughout their conflict. It doesn't go so well for both of them. Both wind up deactivated, but they're able, through their sort of conflicting situation, to still manage to give Luke what he needs, so he's able to contact the Rebel Alliance, and Han Solo is able to come and pick them up. Now, a couple of things about this. One, wow, Hoth appears to be a desolate world that no one knows about. Yeah, that's kind of been blown up by the EU over and over and over again. Most recently, for instance, Hoth is a major battlefield between the Republic and the Sith Empire in the era of the Old Republic and the Great Galactic War, and the Second Great Galactic War when the Cold War part ends and they get back into fighting and such. We will also find, coming up in our coverage here, that Han already knows about Hoth, at least to a degree, as do some of our other characters, because they actually wind up in sort of a conflicting story that's also trying to tell how do they find out about Hoth. They tell sort of a conflicting story of that in the pages of Star Wars 3D, a very short-lived 3-issue comic series produced by Blackthorn Publishing. Between the Marvel era and the Dark Horse era, it was in that gap when most people think there were no Star Wars comics. There were, and one of them was set on Hoth. We also, however, have a story that eventually gets told, revealing the last names of those characters, but a story that eventually is told that gives us more information about Freya, more information about Torlok, and manages to weave them in to the stuff that we see in classic Star Wars from a little bit earlier. It's a comic that we're going to see when our coverage finally reaches 1997, 15 years from now in the publishing cycle, called Shadowstalker, Star Wars Shadowstalker, by Ryder Wyndham. Shadowstalker involves a character named Jix. It's a tie-in story to the Shadows of the Empire stuff. We'll go into more depth with it when we actually see this issue, but Vader, after his defeat in that explosion during Return of Ben Kenobi in the newspaper strips, was found and saved by Jix. And Jix had an encounter with him before, about 9 years earlier, and part of the deal was, look, I will help you, I will save you, I will get you off this planet, and I will serve you. The deal is, though, you don't come back to Eridus. You leave these people alone that have been the people who have considered me part of their society for so long. So Jix winds up joining the Empire. He's the one that Vader sends on a mission to find Torlok and his daughter, etc., in the pages of Shadowstalker. So Shadowstalker actually comes essentially between Return of Ben Kenobi and the Power Gem, the last story that we looked at prior to this one in the classic series, but it's because of that direct tie-in that he was trying to weave with the Torloks from Iceworld. So now the Rebellion knows about Hoth, they know it could be a good base. Now, of course, they're going to wind up using it. They just need to set up Echo Base and whatnot. So, this begs the question, is this an essential read? I kind of gave it away in the introduction here. Yes, I would say that this story, the story of how the Rebels find out about Hoth in the first place, is an essential read. Not because of the Torloks, but because of what it does in terms of opening things up for how the Rebellion goes from its previous base to its next base, right? Yavin 4 to Hoth, in terms of the movie bases that we see. Decent little story, very impactful, not spectacular in the storytelling itself, but a firm impact on the EU. With that, we'll wrap up this episode. Thank you for watching, and may the Force be with the readers.